Greetings everybody. Today we're going to talk about the h3 Sicilian Najdorf. Let's explore e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, take, knight f6, knight c3, a6, Sicilian Najdorf. In the future, I hope to fully cover all the Najdorf videos that I plan to make, and now we have it with h3 here. The idea is to play with a quick g4 thrust, similar to the freak attack with rook g1 and g4. e5, this is my recommendation, because we are actually playing a Sicilian Najdorf and not a Scheveningen. Here, white reaches three main crossroads with knight d to e2, knight f3, and knight to b3. Note that any time white plays a move like knight to f5, then d5 kills white essentially, because the pawn that defends a knight is completely undermined. The pawns are expanded, the bishop's gonna get out, and this is equality at the very worst for black. First, let's take a look at knight to f3. The idea is to discourage bishop e6 due to a knight g5 advance. Here I will recommend queen to c7. The idea is to prevent bishop to c4 for white. We have reached a similar scenario as the knight f3 English with bishop e3, e5, knight f3 line. And queen c7 is also the main line in that move, the modern main line that is. And it is good here too. Play can continue, for example, bishop to g5, knight bd7, and due to the pawn structure of e5 and d6, you always want to keep knights guarding each other in a chain, because you want to be able to recapture with the knight should the bishop ever capture on f6, so that you maintain control of the d5 square. Bishop d3, for example, bishop e7, castle, h6, and bishop e3 followed by, for black, castling, b5, and knight c5 are all ideas, and it becomes a game where black should be generally comfortable. Let's go back. The other move I will look at is knight to b3. The idea for this is that if white can ever get a c4, c5 advance, then this knight will be very useful for facilitating that advance. Here I will recommend bishop e6. The idea is to push d5 should the white pawn ever push to g4, which is the main idea with this h3 line. Basically, if g4 here, which is a slight inaccuracy, then d5 equalizes for black. For example, after e takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop g2, knight takes c3, queen takes, king takes, b takes, and now knight c6 followed by king c7. White's pawns are bad, and black has no problems, no weaknesses. So this is a slight advantage for black. Let's go back. There's also f4, and here I'm going to suggest g6. The idea with g6 is to stop f5 and potentially prepare a bishop h6. After f takes e5, for example, I will do knight to h5, trying to exploit the weakened squares on the h4 to e1 diagonal. For example, bishop e3, knight c6. Note that white never has time really to take on d6. It just becomes horrible with all these pieces bearing down at the king and at the dark squares. Queen to d2, d takes e5, and black has equality at the worst. After g6, you might also see queen to f3 with the idea of possibly trying to strive for the f5 push. Here I will do knight c6, bishop e3, and now e takes f4, bishop takes, knight h5, bishop h2, knight e5, queen f2, and now bishop e7 with the idea of bishop h4. Let's go back. I think this is all you really need to know for if white does knight b3 or knight f3. Okay, we can also take a look at what happens after bishop e3. Here, bishop e7 and queen f3 and castle. And whether the knight goes to d7 or c6, this should be a very comfortable position for black and with no problems whatsoever. Okay, now let's talk about the critical line for white, the most important line and the most popular. Knight d to e2. There are two ideas behind this move. One is to potentially solidify the pawn on e4 with a future knight on g3, ideally after g4 is played for white. So basically with a g4 pawn and then a knight on g3 behind it. The second idea is that after knight to d5, white can renew putting a knight on c3 to have a second knight go to d5 essentially. Here, black has several replies, such as b5 and I believe bishop e6. But here, I'm going to recommend h5. This is Maxime Vacher-Lagrave's choice, and it is the most popular move. I will recommend this. It stops g4, it discourages knight g3 due to any h4 push, and it's just prophylaxis, which is a very important thing to utilize in chess. The drawback is that you are giving this g5 square for the bishop. And speaking of which, in this position, white has two crossroads. He's got bishop g5 and pawn to g3. First, let's take a look at bishop g5. This is the traditional main idea, trying to make use of the g5 square. Black needs to maintain secure control over the d5 square, therefore black should play bishop e6 to neutralize knight d5 essentially. So bishop e6, and now there's bishop takes f6. Let's also look at what happens if knight to d5 first. Here, there is a small trap white has in mind, but black is completely harmless if played with care. Sorry, white is completely harmless if played with care. Bishop takes, e takes, queen a5, c3, and knight b to d7, making the threat of queen takes d5. Do not take with the knight on d5 because of b4, and now you're losing this piece actually because the queen cannot guard the knight. And if queen takes d5 here, then there's bishop takes, queen takes d1, rook takes, g takes f6, and knight g3. The light squares are extremely weak for black, and even though black is a pawn up, the computer scores this position as around 0.2. So knight bd7 is best here, and the idea is to make the threat of queen takes d5 stronger by replenishing the knights should the bishop make a capture on f6. White shouldn't and can't really try to hold on to this pawn on d5, and so the d5 pawn is essentially lost after queen takes d5. Let's go back. Instead, that's why they play bishop takes f6. Here you should play queen takes f6, knight to d5, queen to d8, knight e c3, and now g6. With g6, black intends bishop h6, and the schematic continues castling knight to c6, rook c8, and to play in a fashion similar to that of the Sveshnikov with knight to d4 and also b5 minority attack. bishop c4, main move, bishop h6, castle, castle, bishop b3, knight c6. This is all my recommendation for black. Queen to d3, it's a main move. Rook c8, rook a d1, knight to d4, knight to e2. Now knight takes b3, queen takes b3, and here the old move for black is king g7. This is actually a good move, and it is a move I can recommend for black. The idea is after f4, bishop takes f4, knight e takes f4, e takes f4, queen takes b7, and rook takes c2. With this king on g7 preventing any sort of knight f6 ideas in the future, you reach this sort of double-edged attacking position where both sides have a lot of counterplay. And if you're interested in playing this, which is okay, then I recommend to practice this position with a partner or even with a computer, because it is fun and you'll learn something new about attack and defense. What is a new move exactly? Well, instead of king to g7, oh, by the way, after f4, there's also queen a5, which is worth investigation, and it has some interesting subtleties in mind. The computer also thinks that black holds a slight advantage. Okay, going back, the new move instead of king g7 is b5. This is a novelty, and the reason why b5 wasn't played until later is because of a4 here. But actually, a4 is just harmless here. Here I'm going to recommend rook to b8. After a takes b5, rook takes b5. Black seems a lot more comfortable because of his active rook and hitting the b2 pawn. It takes some strategic understanding of chess to play these positions accurately, right? Well, the most important thing is to make your pieces active. And this is especially the case in the Najdorf. You want your pieces super active and to get a lot of counterplay. Here, after, for example, queen a2, a lot of moves for black here are possible, such as a5, queen b8 as well, with the idea of queen b7. And basically the main thing is to not let white's pawn thrust of c4 to become too powerful. Usually you'll see white play something like b3 and c4. Let's go back. Instead of rook b8, there's also rook c5, which is perfectly fine. And another interesting move, b4, a pretty move that Maxime Vacher-Lagrave picked, although it is kind of drawish, so I wouldn't recommend this. I only recommend this option with b4 if you want a more drawish position, but honestly, why bother? I'm not really sure why Vacher-Lagrave picked this. After c3, b takes c3 and knight takes c3, it seems that white's pieces are where they want to be, right? So, sure, I guess black's pieces are also on good squares, right? But in a game between Vacher-Lagrave and I believe Nakamura, who is white, game between Nakamura and Vacher-Lagrave, this game resulted in a draw, and there was a point where the queen was on b6, took the a6 pawn or something, or no, maybe the pawn was on a5, and there was this perpetual, and then Nakamura avoided it and went queen d3. Like, if you have to make a perpetual so early in the game, then I wouldn't recommend this unless you are content with a draw. By the way, instead of c3, if queen takes b4, then this is not logical because now white, it means that white isn't thinking about what opponent wants. You know what the opponent wants, right? Activity. Rook takes c2, very active. This is no good for white. Okay, let's go back. this is about it for if bishop g5. It is the old move that white used to play with the idea of controlling the g5 square, but black's play makes it very harmless if you play this way that I suggested. The other move that we have to touch on is g3. This is more popular nowadays. Bishop e6. The idea is to go d6 to d5, potentially, which therefore freezes the a2 pawn for the time being. So main move is bishop g2, pretty much the move that you'll always see. If something like a4, then this is a slight inaccuracy due to knight c6, bishop g2, knight b4 with the idea of supporting a d5 advance and making use of the b4 square, castle, and bishop e7. I'm not going to cover this in too much detail because I want to go over more critical lines that have more emphasis, but this is something you can check with a computer at home or look for games. It's pretty safe for black. Okay, instead, bishop g2, and now b5. I'm recommending this move for black because Vacher-Lagrave recently beat Sergei Karyakin with this move, and actually this b5 move was once regarded as dubious by an annotator Edward. The idea is to expand on the queen side before white has a chance to play a4 in an effective manner. And you will see why this annotator Edward, as well as a lot of chess players, thought this b5 move to be dubious, while it is actually a move I recommend, and that is gaining favor nowadays. So anyway, castle, knight bd7, bishop e3. By the way, for this opening, white will oftentimes play bishop e3 to keep control of the dark squares, and then later play bishop g5 a few moves later. One piece of advice I got from Maxime Vacher-Lagrave himself in his annotations is that it is warmly recommended that the white player who is interested in learning this opening for white should study all the subtleties of when to play bishop e3 and when to play bishop g5, and the slight differences that can occur. So, bishop e7. Okay, here is why people thought this bishop e6 with b5 idea was dubious. Here's why. It's because of knight b6. This is the move that people used to play, and the reason why b5 was considered dubious. The reason is that white can restrict black's plan of knight c4 with b3 controlling the c4 square and supporting an a4 advance. For example, b3, bishop e7, queen d2, queen c7, a4, b takes a4, knight takes a4, knight takes, rook takes, castle, rook f1, rook f c8, and now c4. White has a small advantage, but a very comfortable advantage due to the grasp on the d5 square and the scope of the white pieces. Let's go back. So instead, bishop e7 is a good move. And now knight to d5. Here I will recommend, and it's pretty much forced, is knight takes d5, e takes d5, bishop f5, f4, rook c8, natural attacking c2, c3, and now bishop h7. Keeping the bishop safe from any future f takes e5 capture, but interestingly, the computer also likes g6 for black, which has been explored to an extent, and black seems fine here after something like queen d2. You can check this for yourself. But bishop h7, and now the main move is f takes e5. There's also, okay, queen e1, Karyakin actually played this somewhat imprecise move in his game against Vacher-Lagrave. For example, for a reference, check out the game Sergei Karyakin versus Maxime Vacher-Lagrave at Paris GCT Rapid in 2017. Just to give a couple pointers and highlighters, let's show what happened for a few moves here. So castle, rook d1, h4, a thematic idea in such positions to provoke g4. g4, e takes f4, knight takes f4, and now bishop to g5, essentially activating black's bad bishop, a bishop that is considered bad because it was stuck between the e5 and d6 pawns, which are of the same color as the bishop, the dark squares. Ideally, black would love to trade the dark squared bishops in this position and to put pressure on the somewhat overextended d5 pawn. Once again, if you want to see how play continues here, then refer to the game between Sergei Karyakin and Maxime Vacher-Lagrave in Paris GCT Rapid 2017. For the record, black has a plus score in this position, according to the engine. So f takes e5, and d takes e5. Note that knight takes e5 is stupid, because it is very bad to give the d4 square so easily, and you're making your pawn worse. But sure, it may look natural, right? You are controlling d3 and some of the light squares. But after knight d4, this is still very uncomfortable for black. So d takes e5, d6, bishop g5, trying to trade the dark bishop, queen d2, bishop takes, queen takes, and now castle, with equal chances. Okay, if this line is too drawish for you, which it might be, then you might want to consider exploring earlier what I mentioned, g6 instead of bishop h7. But hey, Karyakin is higher rated than you are, and he didn't play the most accurate at this point, so the chances are your opponent doesn't know the theory this deep, and if he or she does, then both sides have a lot of chances still to mess up. And anyway, at a top level, a draw is what black wants, right? So after rook a d1, and then maybe rook b8 with the idea of queen b6 to trade queens, and to exert some pressure after rook d2, queen b6, rook b6, to exert pressure on the d6 pawn possibly, and to keep this knight blockading the pawn. As we know, knights are the best blockaders in chess. And what else? I think that pretty much sums up this video as a whole. At this point, instead of knight to d5, white could try a4, but it really gives nothing for white after b4, because after knight d5, knight takes, bishop e takes, and then bishop f5. After this, it's pretty much the same kind of position, just with the pawns being here, gives nothing for white. Same with queen d2 after rook c8. At some point or another, you know, white will play knight to d5, and it will lead to a position that is intimately similar to the immediate knight d5. Okay, I think that pretty much sums up everything. Basically, the summary is after the Najdorf, h3, play e5, and after knight e to e2, you want to play h5 to stop g4 and knight g3. You'll see g3 and you'll see bishop g5. After bishop g5, the important thing is to keep control of the d5 square and to play in a Sveshnikov style. Pretty easy and pretty solid for black. And after g3, I recommend bishop e6 again, with the idea of playing possibly d5 and to play b5 early. And I think without further ado, we can say that this concludes the video. If you have any questions or comments, then please write them down and I will try to help. Take care and hope you learned something.